Hello, this is Steven now, and we're here with a top 10 video once again. Today, I'll be doing top 10 villains from Batman the Animated Series. Now, Batman the Animated Series is considered one of the best interpretations of Batman out there. It is iconic. Many people say it's the definitive take on Batman outside of the comics. What I like about the series is, other than it was pretty much, it adapted a lot of the comic book villains at the time. Again, really the main comic book villains that were pretty much known to the mainstream by this point were guys like Joker, Riddler, Penguin, Catwoman, and I would say Mr. Freeze. However, the others were kind of not that well known, or not that well known in the really community. So this series really adapted them to, honestly, really good interpretations. So I'm throwing in what I consider some of the best villains from the series. Take into account, this is purely subjective and personal opinion, and I'm judging them based on taste and overall how engaging and interesting I felt the villains were. But before we get into the actual top 10, let's kick into some honorable mentions. The honorable mentions actually go to 3 villains: Rupert Thorne, the Clock King, and Killer Croc. Now, Rupert Thorne is, of course, a crime lord. I like how he's pretty much a recurring character, and it's shown us to be like the big, like, crime boss, mafia, like, I'm guessing mafia don of the city. And when I first watched, I thought he was just, just a character made up for the comic, made up for the series, but he actually came from the comics. I'm surprised it didn't use other crime lord figures like the Falcones or the Maronis, but I will be honest, having Rupert Thorne I felt was pretty fun, as they got someone that was not really that well known, but sort of well known, and I like that. They got the Clark King, again, a completely radical different depiction from, what he usually is. Named Temple Fugit, he's basically a man obsessed with time, and this is not the first time Batman would encounter the Clock King. As we know, he encountered him way back in the 60s TV show. Interesting fact, he fits quite well in the Batman Rogues Gallery, despite the fact he is actually a Green Arrow villain. I absolutely love the voice performance here, and also the design still fits in the show, but also stands out, and his cane has a sort of like clock hand thing I like. And of course, we have Killer Croc. Now, Killer Croc is, of course, another villain that was huge, that was pretty big in the comics at the time, and of course got adapted to the show. His name, Waylon Jennings, wouldn't be revealed until the 4th season, and where he would go through a drastically different redesign. But in here, he's basically this brutish thug that has the appearance of an alligator and goes by the name Killer Croc. He's usually portrayed, in 2 episodes, he's portrayed as being actually serious and intimidating, and even had a famous showdown with Bane in one of the episodes. But he's also portrayed as being a bit dumb-witted and bit comic relief. It's sort of inconsistency, but I like how they could flex the character to portray those 2 different types of his character. I absolutely loved it, and the reason why I have these 3, because they're so good, I felt they needed at least some form of honorable mention. So here they go. With the honorable mentions out of the way, let's hop into the actual list. Number 10 goes to the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow was voiced by Henry Pollock II. And I will be honest, I liked his appearance in the original 3 seasons than 4, even though I will admit the 4th look is very haunting and very drastic, and is definitely heavily influential. I felt it was a bit too much of a departure to the classic Scarecrow. In the series, Dr. Jonathan Crane was a teacher and doctor at this Gotham University. However, his experiments got him fired, and he wanted revenge on the university. So he ended up trying to essentially break the university, but this would lead to a confrontation with Batman. After that, the Scarecrow's motivation would be to bring the city into fear. Now, I like that they established he is obsessed with fear, a very unhealthy obsession with fear. I also happen to find it interesting that he's the villain who is less sympathetic. He was always cruel, always vile as a kid. And I also like he's so delusional, he felt he did nothing wrong. He was just experimenting on this thing. Hell, even on students, it was just, he's almost despicable. Now, not every villain needs to be sympathetic. I don't mind a villain occasionally being unsympathetic. I also like how he's really delusional, and when he sees people getting gassed and having fear in their, being gassed and feared, he takes absolute joy in it. Now, this is not the first time the Scarecrow has appeared outside of the comics. He appeared in the Super Friends series, and I think it's spin-off. But this is his 2nd appearance, and I say this is the most influential version of the character. Now, I also like most of his stories involve really Batman having to overcome fear And that's what I like about his episodes. He's also great in ensemble pieces where he teams up with others. And honestly, he's great. I will admit, he's not really that dimensional or sympathetic, so that's why he's at number 10. But he is definitely, arguably, one of the series' greatest accomplishments. Now, the creators, of course, weren't huge fans of the look, so that's why, they changed it to eventually him having hair in his next appearance. But it wasn't until the fourth one where, he looked basically like a dead corpse. I will admit, even though that one is very influential, I will always prefer the original look, especially the second look. I will always prefer that because he's called the Scarecrow, and he needs to look like a scarecrow. So I will think that this look is drastically the best. Number 9, the Penguin. Okay, I really wanted this character to be higher on the list. He's one of my personal favorites, if not all-time favorite Batman villain. But I will be honest, how they've done with his character in the series, not so good. First off, but I will admit, I like the design of the character. It heavily echoes Danny DeVito's, but that was due to what the creators were contractually obliged to do. But despite having the look be similar, the the characterization is drastically different. He's basically a gentleman thief who does whatever he wants for the, he's called the most elegant crime because of his high status. He views himself as an elegant criminal. This goes in both the voice performance, which was, if I recall correctly, the Penguin in this series was voiced by Paul Williams. They also use his name, Oswald Cobblepot, and he's only one of the 2 villains that is already established and has really no origin story. His episodes here remains to be okay, to even downright deadly, and he's often appears as really ensemble. But I also like how he's given arguably the first of many reform episodes, where the villains try to go straight. I think his was the best one. It also shows another depiction of the Penguin that I think is lost in recent years, and that is the character, the character's shortcomings. He feels like how his look is, how he looks, he's shy about his appearance, and I really like that. And all he wants is love, but people view him as this oaf, and I feel that is really great. Another thing I also will admit, I also like what they did in the 4th season. In the 4th season, they could finally use the original version they wanted and turned him into a mob boss type character, which I felt was a really great direction to go, even though the character looked drastically different. Honestly, I always liked, this is one of my favorite depictions, but I put him at number 9, but not further on the list, even if I wanted to, because in reality, honestly, he didn't really have that really good episodes or great character development, really. And he honestly didn't get some really good episodes to really further explore why he became who he is, let alone an origin. So I can't really put him further on the list in good conscience. So he's at number 9. Coming in at number 8. The Riddler. Another fan favorite of my villains in all the comics. Interesting, in the 60s show, I put the Riddler at number 1, but now he's more at the bottom end of this list. Not saying that he's terrible, but honestly, his character is drastically different. Again, before a while, when you thought of the Riddler, you always thought of the late Frank Gorshin's take on the original series. But the creators wanted to do something different, as that version was too similar to the Joker's personality on the show. The character was voiced by John Glover, who gives a more smug, arrogant, jerk performance, and honestly, that is the interpretation of the modern Riddler. His character is also drastically different. He doesn't wear that onesie, that suit he usually wears. But, he wears this more business suit, but despite that, it is still Riddler. His origin is very sympathetic too. Even sympathetic, he was this game designer, but eventually the corrupt CEO who ran the business, essentially fired him and stole all the rights. Next thing you know, he becomes the Riddler, obsessed with getting revenge on the man, but he also has an unhealthy obsession with riddles, and again, he's a smug, arrogant jerk. Eventually, he has an encounter with Batman and begins their rivalry. But it wouldn't be until the character's third proper episode alone, Riddler's Reform, where we get to study the Riddler's motivation. How he views this whole thing as a game, and he wants to prove himself as superior amongst everyone. John Glover, is it John Glover? Yeah, John Glover absolutely does this role phenomenally. And interesting fact, the voice actor actually played that scientist that got killed in Batman and Robin, you know, the one that was responsible for creating Poison Ivy. A little bit of Easter egg, a little bit of a fun fact there. I also like how that episode ends though in Riddler's Reform, where he's locked in Arkham and he's obsessed with how Batman could have beaten him. There's no way he could have gotten out of that trap. Now, the reason why the character didn't make more appearances is because the writers didn't know what to do with him. They didn't want his riddles to be didn't want to be echoed to the original 66 series, and as a result, they got some of the most brain-teasing and arguably unique riddles. This show also introduced the idea of him being great of a technological standpoint, something that hadn't been done yet and has now been carried over to the comics. I put him above Penguin because this portrayal is so influential, it has reshaped the character to what it'd be in recent years. But I put him down at the bottom of the list because in actuality, he didn't have that lot of episodes, so that's why he's down at number 8. Number 7. Poison Ivy. Now, so far, the Penguin, the Riddler, and the Scarecrow had made appearances before the series. But Poison Ivy was a rare case. She had not yet appeared, and this was her first outing. Dr. Pamela Lillian Isley, aka Poison Ivy, is essentially this hot bombshell, but also intelligent scientist with an unhealthy obsession with plants, and she views them as actual people, and essentially she's an eco-terrorist that goes all the way. I like the look here. It has a sort of film noir vibe to her. Now, she'll look drastically different in season 4, then again, don't they always? But I will admit, I like both appearances very, very well, as it sort of shows that as she's becoming more closer to the plant life, she's also becoming a little bit dehumanizing. She views plants as superior to humans, and views them to be, like, that they should be worth more than human lives. It's very interesting, and makes her one of the most interesting villains. I also happen to like, eventually in the series, she grows to have a sort of a friendship and partnership with Harley Quinn. Now they are sort of like a lesbian couple, either in comics now, but this is where it started. She is absolutely great. I will be honest, when I first watched the series, I will admit, I kind of find her to be okay, but I've grown to really love her portrayal and honestly character. Poison Ivy here on the show was voiced by Dane Pershing, and honestly, when I read a comic and Poison Ivy appears, that's the voice that's in my head when it comes to who I imagine Poison Ivy to be. And honestly, she's fantastic. Again, I'm probably saying that word a lot, but there's sometimes great roles must be done by great voice actors, and what other work can you get but fantastic? Her episodes range to be fun, sometimes mediocre, but she works great in ensemble episodes, especially when she teams up with others, because of her planned obsession kind of alienates her from the rest of her, counterparts, her contemporaries, which I liked. Number 6. The Ventriloquist and Scarface. Just like Poison Ivy, this is the duo's first appearance. They essentially are B-listers, middle villains that aren't at the top, not at the bottom, but exist in the middle. In the show, the Ventriloquist is essentially a mobster who has a very rare case of split personality. Now, ventriloquists are people who don't move their mouths but still project their voices, usually through wooden dummies. And this happens to be, and his wooden dummy in question is Scarface, in which his evil persona communicates through. And the guy looks, dresses, and sounds like those old school 1920s gangsters. Again, the ventriloquist in the show was adapted. I find it very interesting he was adapted because he was very new at the time. Essentially, he was a mobster, or a gang leader, and I like the dynamic between these two. Even when I first saw this, the relationship between the ventriloquist and Scarface have been one of my favorite bits of the show. How they interact, how Scarface treats the ventriloquist. Arnold Wesker's real name never came until the 4th season, and I also like how they treat the ventriloquist essentially as having a split personality. In the comics, it sort of might say that the dummy was possessed, but no, it's in Arnold's head. I also like how he's so delusional. The ventriloquist was willing to kill the ventriloquist. Well, Scarface was willing to kill the ventriloquist, even knowing it would kill him. He'd be dead as well. Just showing us how split the personality is. Even though he's a dummy, don't cross with him. as he's yelling, screaming, and is always around with the Thompson. This is arguably the first appearance, and for me, no matter what's happened, other appearances that have come always have to live up to these two. Now, the ventriloquist and Scarface were voiced by George Duganza, probably butchering that last name, but essentially if I recall correctly, he's voicing two characters, and that's very hard to do, to do two characters and have it be play off each other. The manner he could do that is absolutely fantastic. He's actually one of my favorites, and honestly, just the interaction between these two are so fun, so fantastic, and honestly, he's just great. I would have liked if there was an episode where all like these gangsters were going in a mob war. Imagine what role he could have played or what kind of screen stealing he could be. Despite the fact he's a dummy, do not cross Scarface and the ventriloquist. Number 5. The Mad Hatter. Now, the Mad Hatter, of course, made an appearance already before the show. In fact, he made an appearance in the Batman 66 TV show and, of course, the animated cartoon that followed after that show got cancelled. Which, ironically, in that cartoon, it was more based on the Alice in Wonderland obsession, whilst at the time it was supposed to be Hat obsessed. Of course, around this time, they did go with the Wonderland obsession. And also like how he's a bit sympathetic. Jervis Tetch, that's his real name, that they've, again, adapted. Real name. He works at Wayne Enterprises and essentially a scientist. Eventually comes up to how to, use mind control. But he's shown to be a very timid, shy, and almost just like person that honestly I wouldn't expect to really hurt anyone if he even could hurt anyone. But he has a sort of crush on this woman named Alice. Eventually, after hearing that there was a supposed breakup or fight, which he presumes is a breakup, he tries to win her over and takes her out on the town, essentially trying to give her the best night of her life, but also he's living into his fantasy of being the Shining Armor. He dresses up as in the Mad Hatter costume in order to impress her. I like how the Mad Hatter is presented as a little bit off, but he wouldn't hurt anyone. And also he had the time of his life. He really loves this woman and really just wants to really connect with her. But eventually his fantasy is ruined when he realized that the girl's boyfriend had made up but are getting married. This sends him into a downward spiral. He's upset, and eventually he tries to have him break off with her and have her reciprocate his feelings, but she doesn't feel the same way. But the usual interference by Batman essentially results in a confrontation, and essentially his fantasy is ruined, and he blames him for ruining that fantasy. I like how he's just portrayed as a sympathetic character. And really, when he does do mind control, but it's done in a way where he's not really that villainous. Again, he mind controls people to help give Alice this really great night on the town to cheer her up. And honestly, I just can't help but feel sorry for the Mad Hatter here. And I do like this one little line that he says how he's waited his entire life for her, and Batman just points out that the only thing you've waited for is a puppet, a soulless little doll. And at the end of his origin episode, how he's crying, could not join the dance. Again, he's a little bit unhinged. He has a Wonderland obsession already before he became the Mad Hatter. But despite that, he's still sympathetic. He of course reappeared in several episodes, sometimes in team-ups, and again, the mind control aspect of the Mad Hatter was really introduced here. For many, the Mad Hatter depiction came from this episode. And you want to know who voiced him? Why, it was Roddy McDowall, who of course voiced the Bookworm on the 60s Batman show. So I'd like that nice little continuity and essentially just overall connection to the original. Arguably, I like that they could turn essentially a small-time villain from the comics to essentially a tragic and sympathetic character. Number 4. Mr. Freeze. This show created the modern Mr. Freeze and has since been the depiction many people have. Before the show, Mr. Freeze was usually portrayed as a gimmick villain, but again, but there was a potential for a really good character. The series managed to create a very sympathetic version of the character. In the show, Victor Freeze is a scientist working at Goth Corp, but once his wife is dying of a terminal disease, he puts her in cryostasis in order to keep her alive. But this then results in Mr. Boyle finding out and essentially causing an accident in his lab. His body mutates because of the chemicals in that lab, where he can only survive in a certain degree temperature. He has to wear this suit in order to survive, and his motivation is to get revenge. They literally turn Mr. Freeze into a tragic character, and his whole motivation is revenge for his wife's supposed death, but eventually find out, of course, later in the series that she is alive, and eventually his motivation becomes to essentially find a cure. The villain's backstory, all he wanted to do was help his dying wife, but an accident turned him into a monster. I like how it's questioned who's really the monster, and even though he's cold-hearted, there's still a bit of humanity still there under all that ice. The design of the character and even the voice is what we think of to this day. The episode that he appeared in, his very first, won an Emmy nomination, I think. Or won an Emmy, nominated for an Emmy. But this is arguably a definitive moment where Mr. Freeze was no longer considered a joke villain, but an actual Shakespearean tragedy. And honestly, when we think of Mr. Freeze today by hardcore Batman fans, we always think of this. This is the interpretation that has stuck with many people decades later. Speaking of characters that have become huge and mainstream, number 3. Harley Quinn. Ironically, this was Harley Quinn's first appearance, and she is one of the few characters on the show that never appeared in the comics. She was credited specifically for the show. Although it wasn't revealed her real name, Harley Quinzel, until her special origin episode, which was in season 4, Harley Quinn in the show, real name Harley Quinn, was essentially the Joker's sidekick and girlfriend. And essentially, she was arguably just one of the best bits of the series. This is really where she made her break. Even though she's become more anti-hero now in recent years, her first appearance here is what we think of, voiced by Harleen Sorkins, who honestly just makes it work. The character is just so fun and plays off Joker, especially the relationship. Even though it's a kid cartoon, it's a hint that the two have a sort of domestic, violent type relationship bit. And again, I like how Harley Quinn, when she paired up with Poison Ivy, the two just played off well so with each other. And I also like how she's like a bit of comedy relief, but also still a serious threat because she's like a good fighter. And honestly, when we think of Harley Quinn, despite the anti-hero now, it all started from here. The animated series made Harley Quinn, which was meant to be only appear in one episode, she continued beyond her one episode appearance, and had become arguably one of the most greatest and most infamous comic book characters of all time. To think it started from here, again, the animators really created a very unique and interesting character. Number 2. I'm going to get flack for this, but number 2 goes to the Joker, voiced by Mark Hamill. Okay, I want to clear something. Yes, the Joker is Batman's arch nemesis. And yes, Mark Hamill will be the definitive voice of the Joker. I do not deny it, I accept it, I love his portrayal. But, like I said, I feel that the Joker is just so overused. Now, Mark Hamill absolutely blends two bits of Joker's personality, lighthearted and funny, but also dark and serious. When we read the comics, Mark Hamill's voice comes into our mind. This is the most comic accurate you could get. I'd say more comic accurate than Jack Nicholson. And I also like how he's both been already established, but his origin is kind of already known within the series. Eventually, season 4 will kind of retcon this with his real name being Jack Napier, but still, it's still a great thing. He appeared in so many episodes and is arguably the greatest achievement because of Mark Hamill's performance, who of course we all know played Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars trilogy. The fact that he voiced the character here and still continues to voice him in many, not just other DC property like series spin-offs after this show, but in many other projects as well, the Arkham games and many movies you could name. This just goes to show just how much of an impact Mark Hamill had as the voice of the Joker. He is arguably one of the greatest comic book villains, and arguably Mark Hamill gave us one of the greatest interpretations. Now with all that out of the way, do I consider the best Batman villain on Batman the Animated Series? That title goes to number 1, Two-Face. Honestly, my favorite villain on the animated show. And because of his performance here, for a while, Two-Face was my favorite Batman villain. Again, I went from Riddler to Two-Face, but now it's Penguin. But for a while, it was always Two-Face. Real name Harvey Dent, Two-Face was Gotham City's district attorney until one day getting in with an accident with crime lord Rupert Thorne and already suffering from a split personality, he became the notorious criminal known as Two-Face, essentially a gangster with a obsession with 50-50 chance, the flip of a coin, and of course the fact that there's 2 people in one body, essentially 2 split personalities. I absolutely love the character here. He's essentially this tough guy, constantly flipping the coin. Richard Mole gives, honestly, a really great voice to the character. And I'd say he's the best voice actor to ever voice Two-Face to this day. He had a lot of great episodes with his origin, origin transformation story, Two-Face Part 1 and 2 being some of the series' best episodes. Another thing the series also introduced was the Two-Face costume that is now so iconic to mainstream. When we think of the Two-Face costume, it's always that white and black two-tone suit, black on the evil side and white on the white side, all came from here. I also happen to like how before he was transformed into Two-Face, we were given some episodes before he became Two-Face, and he was seen as a friend to Bruce Wayne rather than Batman, and even on good working relationship with Gordon. He's truly one of the most tragic villains and considered Batman's greatest failure. Honestly, I absolutely love how, they gave some interesting motivations for criminal schemes. His revenge on Rupert Thorne, he does criminal acts, but he does his still law and order days of being taking down the mob, but he does with more criminal means. Eventually, he wants to take over the city by controlling both the law and the criminal gangs in his own twisted image, something I really liked. He's also appeared in we also had an episode to really showcase how split of a personality he's got, and he's really great in team-up episodes. And because of that, I dubbed Two-Face the greatest Batman animated series villain. There we have it. That was my top 10 villains from Batman the Animated Series. Do you agree with this list? Who do you think should be number 1? Did I leave any of your favorites out? Please, write down your opinions in the comments. And until next time, this has been the Steven Hour. And ladies and gentlemen, so long for now.